All right, students, so today we're going to talk about characterization in nonfiction. And in order to do this, we actually need to throw back to Unit 2, where we talked about characterization in fiction. So I'm going to change my slide and review a couple of things with you guys before we dive into the work today. So if you think back to our time in Unit 2, when we were studying Fahrenheit 451 and we were talking about, those of you in honors, we were talking about the text verify. We talked about indirect and direct characterization, so ways that authors are able to reveal things about the characters. And I know for a couple of the classes, we introduced this acronym of STEAL. And so STEAL stands for all of the different ways, whether they be direct or indirect, that an author can reveal characterization. So if you throw back to when we were studying fiction, a lot of times what a character says, so their speech can be a really can be an indirect way for an author to reveal information about a character. The T stands for thoughts. So again, that's another indirect use of characterization. E stands for their emotions, so how a character feels, which again is another piece of indirect characterization. Their actions and their looks. A lot of these are examples of indirect characterization. Now, we could always focus on indirect, but we can also focus on direct. And so direct characterization in fiction is just going to be when the author tells us exactly what the character is like. So if you were to start a sentence with, this character is brilliant, or this character is determined, and then it gives us an example of how that shows up within the character, that would be a really good way for that direct characterization to manifest itself. So I would ask you guys, when you think about nonfiction, because that's what we've been reading, if you think about the story Swimming for Her Life, can we use all of these different indirect characterizations when it comes to nonfiction? I would hope that you would say no, because we can't use all of them. When you think about nonfiction, we're not usually privy or subject to the character's thoughts or the character's feelings or their emotions. So those aren't usually two pieces of characterization that show up in nonfiction, unless you're dealing with an interview where you might be live with somebody, and so you might be able to speak to their emotions or speak to the feelings that they're having at the time. You also get a little bit of thoughts and feelings in nonfiction when you're talking about memoirs. And so then that might be a time where you might see that. But when it comes to nonfiction, there are still several of these ways that we can use and that I'm going to ask you guys to use as you're diving into your reading workshop this week. So here are some ways that characterization can show up in nonfiction. We can still look at what a character says, and this is going to manifest itself in the form of dialogue. So things that the character says, things that others say to them, can all be ways that we can learn about a character and learn about how that character is developing. So characters' dialogue and what they say is going to be a great way to develop characters within nonfiction. Another way that characterization shows up in nonfiction is through a character's actions. So this might be things that they do, this might be how others react to them, or it might be their interactions and their relationships with other characters. So that's something to think about as you dive into your independent reading today. How are the characters interacting with one another, or how do they react to one another? And lastly, in characterization for nonfiction, the author can directly tell you what that character is like. And so we're going to go ahead and take a look at an example now and kind of break down how these different things can show up. And then I'll talk about how you guys need to apply that to your reading today. So I went ahead and pulled an excerpt from the Swimming for Her Life, and so I'm going to go ahead and read this with you, and then we're going to try to pick out some examples of things that the characters say, do, and what the author directly tells us to see if we can infer some things about the characters, and then to see if we can find evidence to support those ideas, because we always want to have evidence to back up what we're thinking. So this is from the section entitled A Big Deal. After arriving in Germany, Yusra had the chance to try out for a swim coach named Sven Spankenkrebs. He immediately recognized her talent. Sarah had injured her shoulder in the Aegean Sea and couldn't swim. Then he heard something amazing. The International Olympic Committee, or IOC, was putting together the first team of refugees for the 2016 Games in Rio. This was a big deal. There are more than 60 million refugees in the world, roughly the population of Texas and California combined. But because Olympic teams are organized by country, refugees, who are basically nationless, have always been shut out of the games. Making the team would be highly competitive, though. There were only 10 spots. Yusra got one of them. So I just really hung on to the last line of this text where it says Yusra got one of them. So that's a great piece of evidence because that is something that she did. And so what I might say about Yusra is that she is, a conclusion that I might draw about her is that she is determined, she perseveres, she knows how to work hard. So this would be an inference that I would draw about Yusra's characterization, and then I would use this piece of evidence from the text in order to back up my claim. So what are some other things? I want you guys to take a minute right now, look back through. Is there anything that a character said or anything that the author directly told us that would be a good example of characterization? The other example that I'll point out that I found as I was reading through this one more time was this part about the coach up here where he immediately recognizes her talent. So think about what that might reveal about her coach. And then this would obviously be a really good piece of evidence to use as a way to demonstrate that characterization. So the last thing that I wanted to show you guys today is just the quick reading workshop steps for success as you think about getting into this mini lesson. So remember that as you are reading today, the last diary entry of John Wilkes Booth, which is a nonfiction text, we're going to be considering characterization. And because you're working on commonlit.org, you can actually annotate as you're reading today. But what I want you thinking about are the 3 bullet points below, which are related to characterization within nonfiction that I just discussed. So how do relationships develop throughout the course of the text? And how do the relationships impact the text? So think about those different reactions of other characters. How do people react with John Wilkes Booth? How does he react to others? How do they interact? What is the relationship between them? How do conversations move the plot forward? So how does dialogue really drive the story forward? Or how does it not drive the story forward? It might be the complete opposite. And then lastly, how does the sequence of events in the text impact how the characters develop? So the way that the action or the way that the character's actions are set up, how does that really impact the development of the character? Are you able to discover things about John Wilkes Booth that you wouldn't have if the series of events didn't happen in that order? So some things to think about. This mini lesson is also going to build on what we covered last week, which is central ideas and supporting details. So don't forget about those things as you're reading today as well. And I hope that this will serve as a really good practice for your Unit 4 summative assessment. Have a great day, you guys. See you next time.